Much has been said about the power of the US and NATO in a geopolitical sense. However, much less has been said about what I believe to be the greatest power of American hegemony. Its dominant cultural influence that extends far beyond the borders of NATO and furthers American values through film, music, and fashion. This is something that is very present in my own life. Despite not being American, I've grown up watching American films, listening to American music, and buying American clothes, and I mean just listen to my fake American accent. Many will say that this is merely superficial, but I don't think so. I think that media has a central role in defining the politics and the culture of a society, and to deny this is to say that Homer was irrelevant to the Greeks, and that rock and roll had no impact in the politics of the 1960s. In a very real way, the stories that we tell, the clothes that we wear, and the music that we listen to will define our identity. In this essay, I will put forth that we have become, to a greater or lesser extent, Americans. First, we will look at the dominant cultures of the past and list the things that they have in common. Then we will define what American culture is. And finally, I will give my opinion on what I believe to be the drastic consequences of American cultural hegemony. What language was spoken in the court of Frederick the Great? The obvious answer would be German, but you'd be wrong, because in King Frederick's court, people spoke French. In fact, French was the universal language of almost all of the European nobility in the 18th century. And not only that, French fashion, architecture, and literature were dominant from Madrid to St. Petersburg. In fact, Peter the Great actually forced the introduction of French fashion and culture by law. A similar trend could be seen in the 19th century, where English culture became dominant. The culottes were out of fashion, and the suit with a top hat were in. This is not only true in Europe, but also extended to the cultures that sought to modernize and westernize, such as Japan and China. This cultural transmission also affects politics. When England was the world hegemon, dozens of countries adopted their system of constitutional monarchy or something inspired in their idea of a parliament with a king, such as Japan, Germany, and Russia in 1905. Now that America has taken over the role of cultural hegemon, the movies that we watch are almost all produced in Hollywood. The same is true of music, fashion, and the chances are that you are right now wearing jeans. Indeed, most countries try to follow the American political system, or at least pretend to be liberal democracies. Finally, this essay was written and is now being recorded in American English because that is the current lingua franca. So in a very real sense, most of us are American, or at least culturally American, even though we were not born in America. In my case, for some of my teenage years, I identified more with American culture than with my own culture. Virtually everything that I watched was in English, and I even found it easier to think in English than in my native tongue. Now I know that my case is by no means isolated, and indeed, there are millions who have never set foot inside America, but are culturally American, expats inside their own countries. Indeed, I believe that the propagation of American culture is one of the main drivers of migration. The people who grow up in the third world grow up consuming Hollywood movies and wearing jeans. Why then is it such a big surprise when they want to migrate to a country that represents a large part of their cultural identity? But how can we explain this? Why is it that people have a tendency to adopt the culture of the current hegemon? Well, why do people nowadays feel attracted to American culture? Simply put, because it is cool in the same way that anything French was cool in the 18th century. Power is always cool. When it is the French that had power, everything that they made was, by extension, cool, including powder wigs and culottes. And now that we are living in a world of American hegemony, we have, of course, adopted new ideas of what is cool. And I'm not going to go into the psychological reasons why people try to copy the culture of the most powerful country of their time, but the important thing to acknowledge is that they do. This means that American culture has incredible cultural influence internationally and that the world is becoming increasingly Americanized. But this leads us to the question of what is American culture. The cultural influence of America is clear, but what American culture actually represents is not, especially when given that America is a large country with many different subcultures. This is all very true, but not all of these subcultures hold cultural influence. So when I am talking about American culture, I do not mean Mississippi and Idaho, I mean California and New York. But if we want to be more specific, we could call this blue American culture as opposed to red American culture. Blue American culture has almost total control when it comes to cultural creation because they have Hollywood, the music industries, the Ivy League universities, and most prestigious newspapers. In comparison, what does red American culture even have? Fox News? Ben Shapiro? The American culture that is exported en masse to the rest of the world is blue American culture. For example, we can see that feminism, a core part of blue America's ideology, has spread to almost every single country and has become incredibly influential. However, American evangelical Protestantism, which is a core part of red American culture, has very limited influence outside of rural America. Furthermore, blue American culture not only ships its ideology abroad, but it also projects its own values onto red American culture, and as a result, a majority of red American culture slowly embraces the cultural values of blue American culture. For example, most conservatives today do not oppose gay marriage, despite this being the majority opinion in California 16 years ago. The subculture that holds cultural hegemony is blue American culture. And like it or not, this is America's culture. So keep in mind that when I write and say American culture, I mean blue American culture, because I believe that the overwhelming majority of red American culture already embraces the values of blue American culture, and I think that a better distinction would be between blue American culture and traditionalist American culture, who completely rejects the values of blue American culture, but this subculture would only represent a tiny part of modern American culture, and so I will not take it into account here. So when I say American culture, I mean blue American culture. So with that disclaimer out of the way, what are the cultural values of American culture? What is the American dream of the 21st century? The difficulty in answering this is that culture is not something that is tangible. A culture cannot be measured or easily defined. And yet, a country's culture has great importance on its politics and on the way that its inhabitants look at the world. So it is very important to analyze cultures and the way that they influence one another, even if there is no objective or scientific way to do so. So in this essay, I will give my own interpretation of what I believe American culture is and what its values ultimately are. So what are the characteristics of modern American culture? I would say that modern American culture is three things. 1. Individualistic. 2. Cosmopolitan. 3. Consumerist. However, I believe that all of these characteristics are reflections of one core value that is at the center of American culture. All cultures have a single value that stands above the rest and gives this society shape. For example, in a theocratic society like the newly founded Emirate of Afghanistan, the core value is serving Allah, and all facets of this society will reflect this, from its politics to its postage stamps. In my humble opinion, the core value at the center of American culture is hedonism. Whatever gives pleasure is good, and whatever restricts it is bad. All other facets of American culture are based on this simple judgment, from its politics to its aesthetics. I also believe that this is the core value of a good part of red American culture, especially its F-150 driving section, but that is a topic for another day. But what is the aesthetic vision that America sells? What is the image of a perfect life that American culture promises? The American dream of the 21st century is a vision of technologically assisted bliss, where each individual is free to enjoy and afford a life full of pleasures, a fulfilling job, a house, a nice car, endless entertainment, and an active sex and social life. We can use this aesthetic vision to explain the three characteristics that we already mentioned. Individualism is important because it gives each individual person the freedom to enjoy whatever pleasures they want without being limited by a dependence on another person. The cosmopolitanism as the result of believing that everybody in the world is entitled to a pleasurable life, and that they should have the chance to embrace American values without being limited by the place that they were born in. The consumerism is self-explanatory, but within it we also find the idea of equality that is so present in the American left. The money required to consume products is seen as a right that every person should be entitled to. The consumption of products has in a certain sense been elevated to the status of a human right, as something that should not be limited by social class or by productive capacity. Indeed, the sexual revolution is the result of applying the logic of hedonistic consumerism to sex. One should enjoy a life of sexual pleasure that should not be limited by traditional morality or even nature itself, both in the limitation of pregnancy and birth control, or in the constraints of biological gender in transgenderism. So how Americanized has the world actually become? The first thing to note is that I am recording this in English, and this is not because of any particular love for the Anglo-Saxon speech. I actually prefer Italian, but I write in English because any serious political ideas that intend to go beyond mere provincialism must be discussed in the lingua franca. In the 17th century, this language was Latin, and as a result, Newton did not write his works in Welsh. Indeed, speaking English is a sign of sophistication in every single country outside of the US. Typically, the bourgeoisie of a specific country will be bilingual and smug about it, while the working class will remain largely monolingual. As a result, the people who can afford it will often go to great lengths to detach themselves from their mother culture, as I once did, and also a big part of this is studying abroad, as any American university student can also attest to. Americanization has also had a great impact in the realm of politics, because essentially the issues that are discussed in most countries are issues and ideologies that have been imported from America. And of course, most new countries have modeled their government based on the American Republic. Another interesting phenomenon that shows the extent of American culture is that most Western Europeans actually believe that they are superior to Americans. This by itself is nothing special. All cultures think that they are somehow superior to the others. What is special about this case is that Western Europe believes that they are superior to America, not because they embrace their own culture, but because they embrace American culture more than the Americans themselves. They get all smug when they have less inequality, have more social programs, are more ecologically friendly, and their right-wing rabble parties, which nice Western Europeans are very, very, very ashamed about, get nowhere near the votes that the Republicans get in the US. Of course, these are not European values, but instead are the values that we already know and love from blue American culture. If you want to see the true effects of Americanism, you also need to see what it has done to the cultures of Western European countries such as Germany. The Germans have been so thoroughly Americanized that they have not created any original media in the last 30 years. All their films are Hollywood copies, and bad ones at that. Their music is mostly made up of pop and rap, both sung in German but originally American. German rap is fascinating because it is sung mostly by Germany's minorities, mostly Turks, which have adopted the music, the fashion, and even the speech patterns of US blacks. However, this Americanization is also present in something as basic as the names given to newborns. Typically, German names such as Hans, Otto, Fritz have been replaced by more international sounding names such as Tim, Felix, and Kevin. On that last one, I was also very surprised to learn that the typical poor person names in both Germany and Latin America were Kevin, Brian, and Brandon. But that's just a note that I found interesting. So, in many ways, every European generation is more American than the last, and the price of this is being less German, English, or Irish. Indeed, I believe that the Americanization of the UK and Ireland even led to the end of the Troubles, since there is no point in fighting someone who has essentially your same values. This was not true in the 70s, but it is true now. But is this not good? Most people do think that Americanization is a good thing, and furthermore, that it is the solution to essentially all of the world's problems. It is no coincidence that the proposed solution to the problems of Afghanistan and Iraq was to turn them into republics with separation of powers and checks and balances. But let's be serious here. The pro-Americanization crowd have very good arguments. American culture has created massive amounts of wealth for its citizens. In this regard, this culture is unmatched. It is also one that incentivizes an active work ethic that has created the USA as it is today. One can call the US many things, but there is a reason they are the world hegemon. They are the richest and most powerful nation in history. In no uncertain terms, we can say that they have created the modern world, and I am writing this on an American computer using American software. Well, made in China, but that's another story. One has to have a certain amount of respect for such a nation and its culture regardless of your individual preference. At an individual level, we can also say that many people will also favor American culture because of its individualism and the importance that it places in individual freedom. The people who live in countries that have been Americanized enjoy a great level of liberty, especially when it comes to their lifestyle choices. Furthermore, the democratic character of American culture leads the individual citizen to feel that he has power over the state and not the other way around. However, the accuracy of this feeling will vary from country to country. These two benefits of American culture, wealth and individual freedom, make such a convincing argument because they stand in contrast to the great majority of the other cultures in the world where the rule is poverty and tyranny. Indeed, it should not be surprising to anyone that many people have come to the conclusion that American culture is so good that it should be exported throughout the world, displacing the other unenlightened civilizations for the good of mankind, of course. Many people think that modern gringo Germany is a nicer country than the German Empire with its mean Prussian militarism, for example. However, the important thing is that we have to realize that American culture is great when looked at from the values of American culture. This is nothing unique. All cultures, and ideologies for that matter, are self-affirming. They see themselves as good according to their own values, making an ethical circle. So if you have been fully Americanized, you will believe that progressive Americanization of the world is a good thing, but only because you have already embraced the values of blue American culture. However, if you have not become Americanized or have come to resent your Americanization, which is my case, you might come to disagree. My personal disagreement comes from the fact that I do not hold the values of blue American culture. Instead, I draw my own morality from a pragmatic Darwinian standpoint, which I explain in this video essay. But I will not go into it right here. But I think that history is characterized by rivalry between different cultures, and the ones that are weak are essentially torn apart. So from my point of view, whatever makes a society stronger and more resilient is good, and whatever makes it weaker and more fragile is bad. From this point of view, one could say that American culture has many virtues, since a prosperous society is far stronger than a poor one, and that the high amounts of personal freedom also lead to innovation, and I do recognize the merits of this culture. I simply happen to believe that they are outweighed by the vices of American culture. The first worrying deficiency of American culture, when looked at from a Darwinian lens, is that it is terribly infertile. All the characteristics of American culture that I have mentioned lead to a lower fertility. An individualist society is less concerned with family and sees it as a matter of pros and cons. Consumerism is also a driver of antinatalism because children are expensive and time-consuming. If you are first and foremost concerned with material comforts, then children are a burden to be avoided. But the most interesting part of the infertility of American culture is its cosmopolitanism. I have had many conversations with people who are adamant that we shouldn't be having less children because the world is overpopulated, despite the fact that their own country has a low fertility rate and is heading towards demographic decline. I have always found this answer paradoxical until I sort of understood it. When I am looking at the world, I see many different nations, and I am looking out for mine. Well, they see humanity as a whole, and as a result, they are not particularly concerned about the future of their nation. In fact, they seem not to be frightened by the possibility that their nation will disappear in a century because they are not French, German, or Canadian. They are a citoyen du monde, and they do not feel that the legacy of their ancestors is on their shoulders. However, there will be many people that will reject the connection between American culture and infertility because there are countries that are infertile and have not been Americanized, such as China and Russia. This is true, but there are two things that must be mentioned here. First, not all infertile countries are Americanized, but all Americanized cultures are infertile. Second, is that even though these countries are normally anti-American, they are still Americanized to a certain extent because they still do consume American media, fashion, and political trends, combined with the fact that the intelligentsia of these countries often goes over to the West to study. Indeed, the daughter of Xi Jinping studied at Harvard. Fun fact, Stalin did not send his daughter to Harvard. The second problem of American culture is more personal and more philosophical. I think that hedonism, the core value of American culture, is a terrible value to base a civilization on. I believe that this is because of one single insight, that we can never find lasting satisfaction from pleasure, and so life in American culture is in essence empty. This is because we get used to all pleasures. What made us jump from happiness yesterday barely gets a reaction today. And so we are delivered to boredom, and we move on to the next thing, and then the next thing. And this is how billionaires can have more mansions than fingers and yet be unsatisfied. But again, Schopenhauer expresses it better than I ever could.
The crowd of miserable wretches whose one aim in life is to fill their purses, but never to put anything into their heads, offers a singular instance of this torment of boredom. Their wealth becomes a punishment by delivering them up to misery of having nothing to do. For to escape it, they will rush about in all directions, traveling here, there, and everywhere. No sooner do they arrive in a place than they are anxious to know what amusements it affords, just as though they were beggars asking where they could receive a dole. Then again, how insatiable a creature is man! Every satisfaction he attains lays the seeds of some new desire, so that there is no end to the wishes of each individual will. And why is this? The real reason is simply that, taken in itself, will is the lord of all worlds. Everything belongs to it, and therefore no one single thing can ever give it satisfaction.
But yet, this cycle of consumption, followed by boredom, followed by consumption, is the engine that drives our economies and our everyday lives. We work to get money to spend it on pleasure, and once we get used to this pleasure, we find another, which requires more money, and the cycle continues ever onward. To quote the pessimist himself once again.
In the first place, a man never is happy, but spends his whole life in striving after something which he thinks will make him so. So, to gain anything we have longed for is only to discover how vain and empty it is. And even though we are always living in expectation of better things, at the same time we often repent and long to have the past back again. We look upon the present as something to be put up with while it lasts, and serving only as the way towards our goal. Hence, most people, if they glance back when they come to the end of life, will find that all along they have been living ad interim. They will be surprised to find that the very thing they disregarded and let slip by unenjoyed was just the life in the expectation of which they passed all their time.
Our entire economy is built on the promise that through this or that product or this or that job, you will achieve happiness. But the reality is that you will not. Happiness, what we can call a state of satisfaction with life, cannot be found in mere fleeting pleasure. This is the reason why I believe that so many people nowadays are so deeply dissatisfied with their lives, despite having access to more dopamine than their ancestors ever could have. This is most evident when you see the average life of the young adult in any Americanized country around the world. They work a repetitive office job, have few social relations, and their free time is spent on endless hours in front of a screen, where they try to escape their real lives. This is especially present in the younger generations who grew up with social media. Not to mention that the average adult is overweight, and that there has been a strong increase in antidepressants and the use of drugs, and it seems that everybody is taking pills nowadays. This is perhaps the most tragic aspect of American culture, that it pushes people to give up on things that actually give life meaning, such as family, passion, and community, in the name of a corporate career that can give them more money to consume more products. So to recapitulate, I do not deny that American culture has great benefits, and that it can do much for a country economically. But at the same time, it leads to a society that has neither children nor future. It leads to a society that runs on the promise that consumption will lead to happiness, but cannot fulfill this promise, and leaves a country made of people who live lives of alternating distraction and dissatisfaction. The reason that I am recording this is that I see how the countries where I have lived are becoming more and more Americanized, both in their increasingly hedonistic lifestyles and in their drastic consequences. I believe that this is a great threat because American culture is the most seductive culture ever created or to have ever existed. It promises a world of pleasures and conveniences where you will be happy. To be fair, it does deliver on half of that promise. American culture has perfected the art of maximizing pleasure, but it cannot deliver on the happiness that we yearn for, because that is not how humans work. The reason that I once believed in this promise is that I did not know myself. It was because of this ignorance that I had the hope that pleasure would one day lead me to happiness, only to disappoint me time and time again. But the fact remains that American culture is extremely seductive, and thus it spreads easily to other societies where it displaces the local culture, makes the country wealthy, but at the price of its virility and its vitality as a nation, and it becomes infertile and will have no future. Its communities and families will dissolve into millions of isolated individuals. And all of these nations will pay all of these terrible prices for a beautiful promise that will be revealed to be an illusion. But by the time that this becomes clear to most people, it will be too late. By the time that American culture is finished with your country, it will be a shell of its former self. And this, sadly, also applies to Americans. For that reason, I see modern American culture as a cultural disease that has infected me, my friends, and my society as a whole. The more that I see how they suffer in the human version of a hamster wheel, the more I find myself cursing American culture and what it has done to our future. But by no means do I blame Americans. In a very real sense, I pity them the most. They are the ones that have been infected for the longest time. In fact, to seek to blame someone is childish. It is not part of someone else's plan. Instead, I think that the propagation of American culture is the result of our weakness as humans. Life is hard. You will not become the person that you could have been, and you will watch your loved ones die before dying yourself. This is the human condition. It is no surprise that we all desperately want to believe that we can escape and have a life full of pleasures. Of course, we do not want to believe that this beautiful promise is an illusion. And as Philip K. Dick said, reality denied comes back to haunt. I think that I also wrote this essay for myself, because a part of me still believes in the promise of American culture, that I will be happy if I buy this or that, if I play some video games, watch some porn, or scroll social media, if I go out to drink and party, etc. Instead, I am trying my best to find satisfaction in the things that actually matter. My romance, my friends, my family, my exercise, and finally my reading and writing. I have not regretted my decision, not even once. To finish, I will leave a quote that seems almost prophetic by Albert J. Nock. Quote, I have sometimes thought that here may be the rock on which Western civilization will finally shatter itself. Economism can build a society which is rich, prosperous, powerful, even one that has a reasonably wide diffusion of material well-being. It cannot build one which is lovely, which has savor and depth, and which exercises the irresistible power of attraction that loveliness wields. Perhaps by the time economism has run its course, the society which it has built may be tired of itself, bored of its own hideousness, and may despairingly consent to annihilation, aware that it is too ugly to be let live any longer. Thank you for your time.